Hi, River. So I just watched your video and it resonated a lot with some of the themes I've been thinking through. So I just wanted to respond to some of the ideas that you brought up. So, one is this idea that harmony is maybe the picture more than unity, and maybe partially why we haven't achieved unity is because the vision of unity impedes its own realization, and also it's just sort of the wrong target to be going at anyway. Um, what you said about like integration and balancing of the desires, passions, chakras, different words in different systems, subpersonalities, IFS parts. A lot of the approach to balancing and integrating them has this flavor of like find hitting the exact right bullseye or like concocting the exact right recipe. It's like forging the philosopher's stone, right? So you're supposed to like get all the parts working in the correct way. Like you said, it's almost spoken of in a machine-like way. And there's sort of this legend, right, that if you get the recipe just exactly, precisely, perfectly right, you can finally do what's never been done and like balance them perfectly. But there's something that goes wrong with that approach. It doesn't just fail because the task is so monumentally difficult. There's something wrong in its orientation and in its execution. Something like the emphasis on needing to make sure everything is correct and know it's correct impedes its ability to function correctly. It's almost like an echo of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's like the more you insist on stabilizing, rigidifying, examining, and like knowing the truth about this thing, uh, the less you can know where it's going relative to the rest of the system, you might say. I suppose you could say that what is being examined is in the conscious, and then in the subconscious is everything else. And if you become too fixed, like Narcissus, on some image before you, for whatever justification, for whatever reason, then you don't know how you're sort of like a leaf drifting in the vast ocean of everything that you've left out. So I wonder if the picture here of harmony rather than unity tries instead to get at what you spoke of with this idea that everything sort of loves everything. There's no piecemeal negotiations, right? That if we can just get the borders to negotiate their bandwidth just right, suddenly the thing will be able to work. It's like just scratch the plan of getting it almost just barely right, just barely good enough, finally, and skip straight to look, make it so that everything works no matter where you put it. Make everything generally good and not just narrowly good and then arranged in the right place. So there's a sort of image here of a juxtaposition of like pure white light and the rainbow. The rainbow, represents the partial light where you subtract aspects of the visible spectrum. And the white light is pure, balanced, complete, wholesome light. And you want sort of both of those juxtaposed here in the sense that on the one hand, you do need everything to be a specialist, to sort of be its own color and to fulfill its role within, the picture of the scene of the movie of life or whatever it is. And on the other hand, you need it to be ready to step outside of its narrow specialized role and do whatever the moment calls upon it to do rather than what it wishes to impose upon the moment. If you compare these to the Mr. Meeseeks in uh, Rick and Morty, and Romeo Stevens recorded some wonderful commentary on Mr. Meeseeks as models of human consciousness. And this idea that we sort of instantiate goal oriented versions of ourselves, this sort of narrow, colored version of ourselves. But then the idea is we, instead of continuing to fine tune those shapes to try and make them better and better at gripping our goals and navigating reality until we can solve our problems, including any looming urgent ones. And you say the plan instead will be to instantiate every narrowly oriented Mr. Meeseeks with an additional complementary layer of universal good oriented sort of layer here. Um, and then the idea, and the hope is that the correct proper pattern here is symbiotic rather than substitutionary. You don't erase the color by adding this layer. Instead, you bring out its best. You present it in its best light, and it, in turn, um, in theory, you could say any individual instance of it will be too narrowly specialized to compete with the pure, complete balance. But when you look at the thing as one among many possible colors, shapes, personalities, then you see that collectively they can do something that can't be done even by the whole, which they collectively make up. But the whole divided into the parts do something different than the whole. Anyway, so one way I've thought about putting this is, if you think of the chakras or the seven deadly sins, or let's stick with that. You can use parts, passions, whatever the system, um, and the standard method seems to be to define a good and a bad version of whatever the thing is, and then try to move continually toward the good version and away from the bad version. There's a If there are seven deadly sins, then there are seven evil wolves inside of you and seven good wolves. And which ones will win? Well, the seven that you feed. And which ones will you feed? Well, it starts, you have to get the seven, you feed these six, and that gives you some of the slack you need to remember to feed the seventh, which is your weak point. But then it goes awry this way. And like life becomes this plate twirling balancing act where you're afraid the thing is going to come crashing down. But part of the hope of the other system is that either there already exists something there to sort of meet you when you reach out to it, and the system doesn't just sustain on your atlas shoulders, but rather uh, it's like you've reached out a hand and been met with a handshake, right? That's the symbol of Adam reaching the finger out to God in the Sistine Chapel. And the idea is, oh yes, God reaches back. Either that already exists in some sense, or you instantiate it in the body and in between bodies. And it's the same pattern which has already been instantiated to make up your body out of cells, and which your cells use to constitute themselves up out of parts. It's this idea that love is this reoccurring pattern that is life-giving and generative and creates many out of a sort of a one, a seed, but then it creates sort of an evolutionary universal Darwinism comes into play. No matter what the system is, as long as there's some kind of many with some kind of difference and any kind of relationship between those qualities and either stability of existence or ability to reproduce, it's inevitable that universal Darwinism comes into play. So up and down the scales, it seems like the pattern produces a sort of seed. The seed produces a variety of versions of itself. Universal Darwinism acts on that variety of the many, and then the many at some point discover a sort of harmonizing pattern that allows them, where once they sort of scattered out, at some point they orient to the same perceived third thing and find themselves meeting back up again. Um, and maybe they never actually hit the same point exactly. Maybe the system stably leads to a sort of oriented around it, whirling around it in all the many ways. And when you add up all of the many, then the pattern of the whirling turns out to look like, some things are more common than others, some are more efficient than others. But when you put them all together, you get something like an electron orbital. And out of the incredible many and variety and the continued sustenance, the sustaining of that many, nonetheless, at the level of higher organization, at the level of the atom or the molecule, the electron orbital is so reliable and stable that we ignore not just some, but literally all of the difference of the many of the movements of the electron. The system at the higher level, you could say, collapses or reformulates into a sustained pattern that sums up the everything into a stable ground on which new being can grow, new ground in which a new seed can be planted and a new many can come out, and a new competition and a new rediscovery of the pattern of love. And if that already, I mean, does it already exist? That's one idea about God, right? That God exists already waiting for you to ask him for help or something. But the other idea is that no, everything is made of God, or this pattern of God, at least the spirit of God. And the creation of that harmony is something enacted by the constituent parts that make up the harmony, or make up the future harmony, make up the thing that hasn't even been made yet, make up, its version of heaven. That the electron discovers its version of heaven and creates the atom, and the atom finds its version of heaven and creates the molecules, and they find their version of heaven and create cells, and so on, and they find their version of heaven and create us. And we haven't yet found our version of it. We are still divided interpersonally. We've been seeking unity and failing to instantiate it. And maybe part of the answer is, if you try to get the electron to follow the one perfect path, I don't know if you could do it or not. You could ask a physicist. But I suspect without allowing it to follow all the paths, there would be no life in the thing. There would be no ability of it to form the ground of a new layer of being. So, as we try to figure out how to, become the harmonized version of our intelligent species, we can take hints from the hypothesis that whatever the successful version of us looks like, it would be able to form the ground of being in which new seeds could be planted, which could then form new diversities of ways of being and becoming, which would then, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, okay, what would that look like? Some sort of harmonized planet. And then if you had many of those, somehow that would be able to form the ground of being for the exploration of something. I don't know, maybe if we're collectively, maybe it's like the collective unconscious, maybe we're collectively exploring certain things and we don't yet see what it'll look like when we have the heavenly version of a collective unconscious and are participating continually in a growthful process. It's just so hard to then imagine that, then turning into a many, and then resolving into a thing, and then using that as a hint. But if it's the same pattern reoccurring up and down the layers of reality, then hopefully we can find hints in the aspects of reality that we can see with current technology and knowledge. So, Michael Levin's work on cellular intelligence and bioelectricity is extraordinary and also a hint and a model for what it might look like for us as constituent parts that don't work together very coordinatedly to level up in coordination and work together harmoniously, and what kind of things that seem undoable right now suddenly become doable once you have those levels of coordination. What impossible things become possible, what superpowers a harmonized version of an intelligent species has, and to what degree we can sort of apprehend those things before they've existed. You know, we can conceptualize them, and even in our wrong conceptualizations, in a movement between the conceptualization and the embodiment, hopefully find our way to a better informed, basically more intelligent version of ourselves, that can take a crack at answering the questions that we are currently incapable of answering successfully. But I don't know. It's like the thing is its own self-description is an interesting pattern to come back to, because it's like, well, if you have the plan to do it, to harmonize a group of dissonant organisms, um, and you follow the plan and it actually works and it goes around doing it more and more and more. It's like presumably the plan it uses to do it more and more is fractally similar to the plan that allowed it to manifest in the first place. It's like this, the manifestation of the plan is in some sense already the thing. This isn't quite right, but there's something about how our ability to do this depends on our ability to see how to do it to some degree. Um, and so, like, the superpowers we will have are, in some sense, the same superpowers we can use the baby versions of right now if we only realized we had them to, you know, create the toddler versions of them and then the child and the adolescent and adult versions of them. So I guess that's sort of the idea, is that we already have the baby versions of the superpowers that will allow us to do great miraculous feats of harmonization and coordination. Um, but we, need to dialogue and think more about what those are, what they look like, how we start using them, and how we grow them into more sophisticated versions of themselves, and just become a generally more capable species with regard to coordination, especially. You know, everything becomes capable of getting along with everything. We want a universal layer of sort of cultural mores, handshakes that everyone can learn to then use to get along with all the people that they don't share a common culture with. We don't have like a common language that replaces everything else. Instead, we have a common language that is symbiotic with everything else, a common culture. So we need to figure out what the rules are. Do people shake hands? Like, what kind of questions are acceptable and polite, and so forth. And knowing what we're trying to get is some help already in starting to detail out what the particulars would look like. So it helps just to name the thing and to say, what we want is, we're becoming so multicultural. We need, and the internet is probably the birthing place for this, because on the internet, we're forced into some kind of pseudo common culture, or at least we understand that we can't possibly expect, things to stay within our particular culture. So we want a sort of common culture that people can use to be minimally polite and nonviolent and coordinating with each other, um, without offending any of the cultures out there too much. Um, and we don't have that. And I don't know if we have proof exactly that it would work, but I feel confident that something like this is an inevitable technology of an increasingly coordinated species. And so, if we're not coordinated enough to stumble into it by accident, maybe we can be forward thinking enough to design the blueprint and then build it out. And, you know, maybe in some sense that means that we're creating these things ahead of schedule by using intelligence design. Or maybe it means, we're a little bit deficient in finding these things instinctively. And so we have to think our way there. And until we can make it make sense, we're going to struggle to coordinate and harmonize in the ways that a more, loving version of us might do. They might do it even without a plan, an explicit plan. Anyway, so these are some of the thoughts. I've gone longer than I intended, but I wanted to speak on those things and sort of touch on this idea, um, that you take the deadly sins or the flaws, the parts, the subpersonalities, and instead of learning to starve them to death like evil wolves, you feed them, you accelerate them, you grow them along with their neighbors, and you discover in their general area something of value, and they become, you know, the first glimmer that hints at a greater light. And even if the first glimmer is foreboding by itself, developed properly, it, becomes actually the positive hint of the thing to come. Um, and so they are not to be treated as enemies, but future allies, and to be cultivated and fed and developed. And there's a sort of trust that if you cultivate them in good faith and get them big enough, as they contain more and more of reality, there's a little bit of a trust in the nature of reality, or perhaps as a trust in the context that you begin to embody, is you trust in a sort of wholesome background context that, left to its own devices, just sort of tends toward harmony anyway. Um, so those are some first thoughts. I'll wrap it up, and I'd love to dialogue further, but I've gone much longer than intended anyway.